Surrealist paintings are doorways into astonishing imaginary worlds. While these territories are strange, they are also strangely familiar. Somehow, viewers relate to what they are seeing, perhaps from a vague memory of having encountered these landscapes before. An exhibition jointly presented by the Katona Museum in New York and the Mint Museum in North Carolina, entitled Double Solitaire, The Surreal Worlds of Kay Sage and Yves Tanguy, celebrates two of the Surrealist movement's leading artists. The 46 paintings that make up the exhibition highlight the beguiling beauty of Surrealism. Photographs and documents on display also chronicle the romance and marriage of Sage and Tanguy, as well as the milieu in which Surrealism developed.
Surrealism really was born out of the movement called Dada that developed just after World War I.
World War I, or the Great War as it was called at the time, left in its wake a devastation that had seldom been seen in Europe. Intellectuals and artists questioned the prevailing modes of thought that could have brought about such a calamity.
They found themselves in the center of a world that was supposedly guided by reason, and look what happened. You know, they were surrounded by total devastation.
André Breton, a poet and writer, is credited with being the founder of Surrealism. During World War I, Breton, who had trained in medicine and psychiatry, worked in a psychiatric hospital where he employed Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic practices with soldiers suffering from shell shock. Through these experiences, Breton became an ardent believer in the power of the subconscious, free association and dreams as a way to liberate the imagination and reveal hidden truths.
And a group grew up around him. He was really the leader of the group, writers and poets and artists.
Breton and his early Surrealist followers also strongly advocated automatic writing,
which is a way to try to create without any control from reason. Just let your mind wander and make associations, and as a way to stimulate the imagination.
The Surrealists advocated a positive revolution in thought that would lead to a better truth. These ideas were put to paper in Breton's Surrealist Manifesto of 1924.
And basically what he said was, we have to find a better truth. Reason didn't work.
And then they kind of took from that this idea that they really wanted to make the subconscious, the unconscious, visible.
While Surrealism began as a literary movement, visual artists soon followed. Characteristics of Surrealist paintings included elements of surprise, unusual juxtapositions, and dreamlike landscapes. For these artists and writers, Surrealism was more than just a method. It was a philosophy and a way of life.
It was very controversial at first, and the Surrealists, because they celebrated the absurd, would kind of create installations that, you know, where the paintings were hung in unusual ways, or Marcel Duchamp, who was involved with the movement, did installations where, you know, the whole ceiling was hung with old coal sacks, or he would run string through everything. And so there was really a kind of a playfulness and also an unconventional nature to the way that they approached art and life.
The first generation of Surrealists included the German Max Ernst, the Italian Giorgio de Chirico, Spaniards Jean Miro and Salvador Dali, the American Man Ray, and Frenchman Yves Tanguy. Tanguy was born in Paris in 1900. After a stint in the Merchant Marines, he decided to be an artist after he saw a painting by Giorgio de Chirico.
Tanguy had been painting in Paris for four or 5 years, involved with the group, and Dali came to Paris in the late 1920s, and you know, I think Tanguy, the kind of work that Tanguy was doing, influenced Dali to some extent.
Kay Sage, by contrast, was an American who came later to the Surrealism movement. During a stay in Paris in 1936, Sage saw and was struck by Surrealist paintings that were on display at the hotel she was staying at. One painting in particular stood out for her. I Am Waiting for You, a 1934 painting by Yves Tanguy. Shortly after, she began to paint in the Surrealist style. By 1938, she had painted enough works to present an exhibition at the Salon de Sœurs Indépendantes, near the Porte de Versailles. This led to meetings, and soon, Tanguy and Sage were a couple.
She never actually became a member of the group, but because of her relationship with Tanguy, she was certainly a part of what was going on at that time.
Their residence in Paris was cut short by the onset of World War II. Because Surrealism had become associated with communist and anarchic leanings, many of these artists felt it safer to flee Europe than to contend with whatever regime came to power. Sage and Tanguy moved to the United States.
I think it had a pretty long run. I mean, it began in Paris in the mid-20s and sustained itself pretty strongly up through the 30s, up until World War II. And when that happened, the artists kind of got scattered and dispersed, and a lot of them actually came here. Tanguy actually came to America with Sage and lived about 20 miles away in Woodbury, Connecticut.
In rural Connecticut, Sage and Tanguy enjoyed life among a group of leading artists, including other Surrealists in exile. In this photo, Sage and Tanguy enjoy a picnic at the home of Alexander Calder, along with Marcel Duchamp. In the summer of 1954, the Wadsworth Athenaeum of Art in Hartford, Connecticut, presented a joint exhibition of Tanguy's and Sage's works. Despite sharing a catalogue, each artist's work was shown in separate galleries.
The artists didn't want it shown together that much. I think they each really wanted to establish their own careers, and historically, wasn't the right thing to do to suggest perhaps that the husband influenced the wife, or even vice versa.
Critics at the time and since have downplayed any commonalities among their work, and instead emphasized the differences of vision and technique among the artists. Some critics have compared these scenes to a beach on which exotic shapes have washed up. At times, the shapes are angular, and at other times, smooth and vaguely reminiscent of animal organs, amoeba, or plant spores. Sage's scenes, by contrast, typically include a tight palette of muted colors and, in a departure with many Surrealists, ghostly man-made structures. Her work can be representational, as in this portrait, or, when she uses drapery to cover forms, suggestive. The draperies cover familiar but unidentifiable forms, perhaps a human.
I do know that she said that they didn't speak very much about their painting, but she is on record as having said, I admire his work more than anything, but I try very hard not to be influenced.
The double solitaire exhibition marks the first time their works have been placed side by side. We see the individual evolution of each artist, as well as how their personal lives impacted their work.
We're just so excited that we finally are able to present it.
And it's a great love story because it's a snapshot of the art world in the 1950s when Kay Sage, as a young and up-and-coming artist, and Yves Tanguy, as a very established European painter coming to America. It was certainly that she was in the shadows. You know, when they did the Wadsworth show, they gave Yves Tanguy the main galleries. She had print galleries that were off to the sides and kind of off from the main gallery where Yves Tanguy showed his work. I think that is one area. I think it's a great love story. They were very highly connected intellectually, spiritually.
It is also a story of tragedy. Both Sage and Tanguy were superstitious, and the appearance of a bird inside their Woodbury, Connecticut home troubled them, as the Italian tradition stated that a bird in the home was a harbinger of death. In 1955, Tanguy suffered a cerebral hemorrhage that claimed his life. Sage's paintings during her bereavement included A Bird in the House and Tomorrow is Never, and reveal her despair and loneliness.
A number of changes that occurred in her work did come about as a result of her life story with Tanguy. After he died, she fell apart, and then we see the beginnings of her actually modeling some of her last paintings compositionally on some of his last paintings compositionally.
In January of 1963, Sage committed suicide.
On one hand, the show brings together the paintings to look at how artistically they influenced each other, but then there are things like the very last paintings in the show are very definitely Sage's response to Tanguy's early death, and they're very dark and brooding paintings.
Among her notes was a suicide letter that read, "The first painting of Eve that I saw before I knew him was, I'm waiting for you. I've come. Now he's waiting for me again. I'm on my way." At Tanguy's request, his ashes were preserved until his wife's death. After Sage's death, their ashes were mixed and their friend Pierre Matisse spread them on Tanguy's beloved Brittany coast.
It's the ultimate sacrifice, and that story is where it's kind of Shakespearean.
And it's a very powerful love story. It's both their lives and their art are really the stuff of dreams.
I think a painting or a poem or something is something you have to be, that survives over time, is something that one can return to again and again and again, from one generation to the next to the next. People continually are renewed by it or find something that attracts them. So it seems that it's characteristic of surrealism, it's part of, it's intrinsic to surrealism, that it will hold its attraction. Because you can return to it again and contemplate it. There was an English art historian called Herbert Reed who said that a work of art must persist over time as an object of contemplation, or else it's an artifact. It's not a work of art. And certainly surrealist paintings have that characteristic.
Surrealism has had far-reaching impact on modern culture since Yves Tanguy and Kay Sage. Surrealist paintings continue to invite us to dream and imagine.